Inheritance. Inheritance is the transfer of a deceased person's property, rights, obligations, and responsibilities to heirs or beneficiaries, guided by legal, cultural, or religious rules. It covers both tangible assets, land, houses, money, jewelry, belongings, and intangible ones, business ownership, intellectual property, investments. Though inheritance is a fundamental human right that should apply to everyone regardless of gender, women were historically deprived of this right with only rare exceptions for centuries. Inheritance systems reveal a society's power structure and values, shaping wealth distribution and defining who continues family lineage. This chapter studies women's unequal status in inheritance across major traditions, including pre-Islamic Arabia, Brahmanical India, Hebrew Old Testament law, Mesopotamia, Athenian Greece, Egyptian customs, and ancient China. Drawing upon scriptural sources, ancient legal codes, and modern scholarly studies, it becomes clear that the exclusion of women from inheritance was neither incidental nor occasional, but part of a deep, systemic structure of patriarchal control. In pre-Islamic Arabia. In the case of pre-Islamic Arabia, this reality was marked by a distinct pattern of exclusion, where women were systematically denied access to property and material wealth. Their very presence within the family was considered secondary, while the male members defined by their capacity to fight and defend the clan were regarded as the sole inheritors of property. The family structure was deeply rooted in the principle of asaba, a male-centered kinship system. As Silardo notes, in the pre-Islamic period, the Arab family was socially and politically composed of males, asaba, namely those who were able to fight and defend the common property. At the pater familiases, father of family death, the familial estate was transmitted only to males, pro indiviso. Agostino Silardo, Inheritance Segur Islamic Period. Encyclopedia Iranica, Volume 3, Fasker 2, 2004, 131-140. Also, pre-Islamic Arabia took this exclusion to an extreme. Women did not inherit property at all. Instead, they themselves were inherited. Widows could be claimed by the deceased's male relatives, and daughters had no share of inheritance. N. Zahra Rizvi summarizes this system. Women were considered to hold no status whatsoever, which made them non-existent in the question of inheritance unless another man inherited them as property. Women's inheritance and its historical development. This underscores how women stood outside the circle of inheritance, unseen and unheard. Their worth was measured not in rights, but in possession. To men, they were not heirs but inheritances themselves, transferred as objects, a silent reminder of how their identity and agency were erased from the very structure of lineage. The marginalization of women in inheritance was not only customary, but also sanctioned and practiced across tribal society. Islamic exegesis of the Quran records that the earliest revelations concerning inheritance were in direct response to this entrenched inequality. As Tafsir al-Tabar preserves, as narrated to us by Al-Hasan ibn Yahya, who said, Abd al-Razak informed us, who said, Mamar informed us from Qatada, who said, they did not give inheritance to women, so this verse was revealed, for men is a share of what the parents and close relatives leave. Tafsir al-Tabar, Surat al-Nisa, Ayah 7. Similarly, Ibn Kathir reiterates the same historical reality. Sa'd bin Jubair and Qatada said, the idolaters used to give adult men a share of inheritance and deprive women and children of it. Tafsir Ibn Kathir, Surat al-Nisa, Ayah 7. The issue of exclusion went beyond mere financial property. It penetrated into the very conception of women's roles. As W. Robertson Smith highlights in his foundational study of kinship and marriage, a woman surrendered her procreative rights, one form of property, to a husband. She also was denied the right to inherit material property. W. Robertson Smith, Kinship and Marriage in Early Islam. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1903. Preface, X. This underscores a dual dispossession. Women not only forfeited autonomy over their reproductive capacities within patriarchal marriage, but were also excluded from economic continuity through inheritance. The outcome was a system that positioned women primarily as dependents, obligating them to rely on fathers, brothers or husbands for subsistence. Such inheritance vulnerability was not incidental, but rather an intentional and embedded feature of the pre-Islamic framework. Final thoughts. The historical record shows that women's exclusion from inheritance in pre-Islamic Arabia was a deliberate product of patriarchal kinship. Wealth and authority remained in male hands, while women were reduced to dependency, valued more for reproduction than for economic security. In Hindu law, the Manusmrti, a cornerstone of Hindu law, codified the exclusion of women from property rights. It declared women permanently dependent upon male authority. By a girl, by a young woman, or even by an aged one, nothing must be done independently, even in her own house. Manusmrti 9:3. Even the idea of women holding their own property was rejected. A wife, a son, and a slave, these three are declared to have no property. The wealth which they earn is acquired for him to whom they belong. Manusmrti 8:4-16. Here, women were rendered not heirs but dependents, economically invisible, bound by austerity, and forever tied to the male line. Under the verses of the Manusmrti 141-151, inheritance is described as a strictly male-centered institution. An adopted son, Datrima, could take the full inheritance of his adoptive father, but he was cut off entirely from the estate and lineage of his natural father. Illegitimate sons, such as those born from adultery or from a woman who was not properly appointed to bear children, were denied inheritance rights and considered ineligible to share in property. On the other hand, a son born through niyoga, levirate marriage, where a brother or relative raises offspring with the widow of a deceased man, was considered legitimate and could inherit like a natural son of the deceased. Final thoughts. Women themselves were not recognized as heirs in these laws. A wife could act as a custodian of property on behalf of her son, and women could hold onto their personal gifts and ornaments, strudun, but they had no independent right to inherit the broader family estate. Thus, according to the Manusmrti, property was passed down through male descendants and relatives, while women were excluded from inheritance except in the very limited sphere of their personal belongings. The Hebrew world, conditional heirs and silent widows. In Jewish law, sons were the primary heirs, and the eldest son enjoyed a privileged share, the sons as heirs. According to the Torah, Old Testament, inheritance was designed to flow through the male line. Sons were the rightful heirs, and the eldest son received a double share of the estate, a privilege that reinforced male authority. Deuteronomy 21:17. In this framework, property remained firmly in the hands of men, ensuring the preservation of family wealth under male control. For daughters, the law offered no natural pathway to inheritance. A woman's right to inherit was never assumed. It arose only when no sons existed. This meant that a daughter's claim to her father's wealth was not rooted in her dignity as a child, but in the absence of a brother. The daughters of Zelophehad, a conditional victory. The most famous case in Jewish scripture that touches on women's inheritance is the story of the daughters of Zelophehad, Numbers 27:1-11. Their father had died without sons, and by law, his estate would pass to distant male relatives. Refusing to accept this erasure, the daughters approached Prophet Moses, Musa alayhi salam, and pleaded, "Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives." Their petition was extraordinary for its time, women speaking directly in defense of their rights. Moses presented their case before God, and the ruling came that daughters could indeed inherit when no sons were present. At first glance, this seems like a breakthrough. Yet, even this concession was tightly bound by conditions. Later, in Numbers 36-6-9, the daughters were instructed to marry only within their tribe. If they married outsiders, their inheritance would pass to another tribe, diluting tribal wealth. Thus, even when women were allowed to inherit, the law served the interests of tribal preservation rather than true gender equality. Women were made instruments of tribal economics, not independent heirs. The widow's plight. If daughters occupied a fragile position, widows were placed in an even harsher reality. Widows did not automatically inherit their husband's property. Instead, the estate passed to sons, or if no sons were present, to other male relatives. The widow's security was not found in ownership but in maintenance from the estate. She could remain in the household, but her claim was temporary and dependent on male heirs. In essence, she was a dependent rather than a rightful heir. In cases where the deceased left no children, the widow was often subject to levirate marriage, yibum, described in Deuteronomy 25:5-6. Here, she was expected to marry her deceased husband's brother, so that a male heir could be produced to carry on the family line and keep property within the clan. The widow herself was treated as a vessel to preserve lineage and wealth, her life bound to the continuity of male inheritance rather than her own rights. Final thoughts. Taken together, these laws paint a clear picture. Women's inheritance was secondary, conditional, and restricted. A daughter could inherit, but only in the absence of sons. A widow could survive, but without ownership. Even when women received property, their rights were framed within conditions that protected male authority and tribal wealth. In ancient Greece, inheritance law revealed the sharp boundaries of gender inequality. Women were not seen as autonomous heirs, but as conduits through which property passed, ensuring that wealth remained within the male line. This system reduced women to instruments of transmission rather than rightful beneficiaries, making their economic identity dependent on fathers, husbands, and sons. The institution of the epikleros in Athens captures this injustice with clarity. When a man died without sons, his daughter was not empowered to inherit her father's estate in her own right. Instead, she was compelled to marry her closest male relative, through whom the property was secured. The estate did not belong to her, but she was tied to it as a vessel for its preservation. As Lynn Foxhall notes, for Athenians, relationships between women and property were problematic. Because property ideally passed from one household to another over time through men, even when those men might be related to each other via women, women were often represented, especially by men in courtroom settings, as if their only relationships to property were constructed through their relationships to men. In fact, women's relationships to property were far more complicated. Their relationships to different categories of property, notably real estate, may have been quite different from those of men. They are certainly difficult to perceive and to understand through our surviving sources. Lynn Foxhall, Female Inheritance in Athenian Law, Harvard University, accessed September 29, 2025. https share.google x13dwreocgfetnew0. Epikleros, an epikleros, plural epikleroi, was a daughter without a father or brothers, often called an heiress, though she did not inherit directly. The term comes from kleros, estate, and epi, over, pertaining to. Scholars debate its meaning, but the most likely interpretation is one in charge of the estate. In practice, her control of the estate was temporary. The goal was always to restore male-to-male inheritance, ideally through her son. Unlike a direct father-to-son transfer, which happened privately, an epikleros case required legal oversight. The Athenian archon, chief magistrate, had to approve the family's decision through a process called epidikasia. If the succession was disputed, the matter went to court for a jury trial, diadikasia. Foxhall, Female Inheritance in Athenian Law. This arrangement reveals a fundamental truth about Athenian society. Inheritance flowed not to women, but around them. Their presence was necessary to bridge generations, yet their exclusion from property rights was deliberate and systematic. Greek inheritance law more broadly reinforces this exclusion. Succession was determined by proximity of kinship, yet at every stage, women were subordinated to men of equal rank. A daughter could inherit only in the absence of sons, a sister only if there were no brothers, an aunt only in the absence of uncles. Even when a daughter became an epikleros, the law ensured that her marriage redirected the estate back to the male line. As David Shapps observes, the fact that the sisters have no rights in presence of brothers shows us that the limited inheritance of daughters was a special provision in their favor and does not reflect a general equality or near equality of women. David M. Shapps, Economic Rights of Women in Ancient Greece. Edinburgh University Press, 1982, 23. This was not a uniquely Athenian practice. Other Greek city-states followed similar hierarchies. In Gorton, inscriptions of inheritance law show sons listed first, daughters second, followed by brothers, with daughters explicitly excluded wherever sons existed. Likewise, an inscription from Naupactus detailing land division prescribed the same order: sons, then daughters, then brothers, but made clear that daughters' claims vanished if sons survived. These rules reveal a consistent ideology. Women could serve as transitional figures in the chain of inheritance, but they were never regarded as full proprietors. Their access to wealth was temporary, mediated by their relationships to men. Their capacity to inherit was less a recognition of equality and more a safeguard to preserve male continuity when no closer male heirs were available. Final thoughts. In ancient Greece, inheritance laws allowed women limited roles. Daughters could inherit only in the absence of sons, or as epikleroi, but their rights were tightly controlled to preserve male authority. Women were essential for passing on property, yet denied true ownership, reduced to instruments of continuity rather than independent heirs, reinforcing patriarchal dominance across generations. In Mesopotamia, inheritance law in ancient Mesopotamia reflected a deeply patriarchal framework in which women were rarely recognized as autonomous heirs. Property, titles, and authority were expected to remain within the male line, and legal provisions ensured that women, whether as daughters, wives, or widows, functioned more as conduits of property than as rightful inheritors. According to common law, once a woman was married and transferred to her husband's family, she effectively ceased to belong to her natal household. Consequently, she forfeited her right to inherit from her father's estate. What she carried with her into marriage was the dowry, and this was not regarded as an enforceable share of inheritance, but as a voluntary gift bestowed by her father. In effect, her dowry substituted for her rightful portion, while simultaneously denying her legal claims to the broader estate. As scholars note, the dowry she took away with her could perhaps have been seen as her share of that inheritance. The one difference was that a woman's dowry was seen as a voluntary gift which did not entail any rights. J. Klima, Archiv Orientalny Otin, No. 3, 1950. 150 at 1 Warmruff, G. R. Driver and J. C. Miles, The Babylonian Laws, Volume 1, Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1956, 337, K. Butts, Oriens Antiquus 19th, 1980, 29-35. Only under exceptional circumstances did women appear as heirs in their own right. In the Old Babylonian period, evidence suggests that unmarried daughters could sometimes inherit alongside their brothers. For example, documents record instances where a daughter's share was roughly equal to that of a son, but only when she remained unattached to a husband. Once married, her claim dissolved, and her dowry defined the limits of her economic participation. This principle underscores the conditional and precarious nature of female inheritance. Even when women received property as gifts or occasional portions from their fathers, these assets were not secure. Upon a woman's death, such possessions reverted to her male relatives, her brothers, or her sons, rather than passing through a line of female descent. H. Petcho observed that while dowries and occasional grants were common in the Neo-Babylonian period, they never amounted to true inheritance. These gifts were well known in the Neo-Babylonian period, but at that time, daughters did not inherit. H. Petcho, Z.S. 76, 1959, 86 No. 149. There were, however, scattered exceptions that reveal legal acknowledgement of women as heirs in rare cases. Gudea, ruler of the city-state of Lagash, famously declared, "From the house that had no son I allowed his daughter to act in the capacity of its son and heir." Gudea Statute B. Vesson 4446 with Rhyme 3-1, 1997, 36. Similarly, the Law Code of Ur-Nammu recognized a daughter as the legal successor if her father died without sons. If a man should die while he has no son and heir, then his daughter, who has no husband, shall be his successor. Ur-Nammu, paragraph B2, Kuzas 17, 2011, 249 with 268. C. Vilka, Festschrift, J. Krecker, 2014, 552, f. M.T. Roth, Law Collections, 1995, 26. In general, women had no independent inheritance rights. They were treated as conduits, not heirs, with property passing back to men. Any gifts or dowries were conditional and reinforced male dominance. Final thoughts. The Mesopotamian case reveals the deliberate marginalization of women in early legal traditions. Deprived of independent inheritance rights, they functioned merely as conduits through which property reverted to men. Rare and conditional acknowledgments of women as successors served only to preserve male lineage. Inheritance thus became a legal instrument of patriarchal order, curbing women's autonomy while consolidating male dominance. In ancient Egypt, women enjoyed more visibility than in other ancient cultures, but inheritance still prioritized sons. As Sandra Lippert explains, although women could inherit in certain circumstances, the general principle was to transmit property through male descendants, while daughters and wives were secondary. Inheritance, UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology, 2013. Thus, women's inheritance was tolerated only in the absence of men, never as a principle of equality. Final thoughts. In ancient Egypt, women had more social visibility and legal rights than in many other ancient societies, including the ability to inherit property in certain situations. However, inheritance primarily favored male descendants, with daughters and wives considered secondary. Women could inherit only when no male heirs were available, reflecting a system that tolerated female inheritance rather than treating it as an equal right. In ancient China, a woman's social and legal position was defined largely through her relationship to men, leaving little room for autonomy. As Milner notes, a woman had to remain single, when widowed, with no property rights. Milner, Larry S., 2000. Hardness of Heart, Hardness of Life, The Stain of Human Infanticide. University Press of America, Pine 237. Final thoughts. This highlights how Confucian ideals of filial piety and patriarchal continuity shaped women's roles. Widowhood was not simply a personal tragedy, but a legal and social condition that restricted a woman's ability to remarry or claim inheritance, reinforcing the family's control over property and lineage.